welcome back to the Physiology of Singing, yeah! Talking a little bit more about the larynx because, well, it is a thing that people tend to talk about an awful lot as singers. As to be expected, we tend to use our voice a little differently than most folks. But I just realized the thing that I left out that I feel is good for singers to keep in the back of their mind because, once again, it's that human thing that singers tend to kind of forget about or ignore. And that is that the larynx, biologically speaking, kind of one of the prime directives, I guess. You can remember your Star Trek days, remember the prime directive. Okay, anyway, one of the prime directives of your larynx is to protect your airway. And it does that during swallowing. It's a very effective thing for that. And it's also, good for like coughing and stuff, if you cough or whatnot. So I know a lot of singers are told not to clear their throat excessively and not to cough excessively. And it's true, you don't want to do excessive amounts of those things. But every once in a while, if it's, coughing is needed, if things go down the wrong tube and you end up coughing a ton, don't suddenly worry that kind of coughing fit might cause a bit of a vocal injury or might result in a vocal injury, because the likelihood of that happening is fairly low, unless you already have a bit of a problem that it exacerbates. That's possible. But the reason you cough so much, and you're gonna do it because your body does not want things going in its lungs other than air. Stands to reason, right? So if that friend makes you crack up at dinner while you're taking a drink of your water or your wine or whatever, and it goes down the wrong tube, and you're just like for like ever after that, and you're waiting to recover, that is a completely awesome and natural physiological reaction to when fluid or food enters the laryngeal petiole. So essentially any of that area, like right around the epiglottis and behind it, anytime anything gets in there and contacts any of that tissue, the internal branch of the laryngeal, the supralaryngeal nerve, which comes from the vagus nerve, it's a cranial nerve. You can Wikipedia cranial nerves and look at the vagus, and it's like, vagus means wanderer. It wanders all around your body. It basically handles a lot of your torso, and 80% of that nerve is sensory. Kind of cool. Most of it's coming from your gut. But in your larynx, that the superior branch, so it's a nerve axon that branches off of the vagus nerve and enters into the larynx, and it has an internal branch and it has an external branch. And the external branch is what innervates your cricothyroid. It's what stretches the vocal folds, particularly when you're going really high in pitch. Whee! We don't use it too often in our speaking range, but for singers, yeah, we use it when we go way up there. And the internal branch handles the sensation of when things touch your vocal folds that you don't want touching your vocal folds. So if like water spills in there or something, it's a natural reaction to cough. Now, when people have swallow problems, there are people in the world who have an issue with swallowing, which sounds kind of nutso, but when people have stroke, other neurological conditions, anything that kind of upsets that neurological pathway, they can have an issue where they don't sense it. They don't sense stuff going in, or where they're not able to close up the larynx sufficiently and move it out of the way during a swallow. So what happens during a swallow, these are going to be your two tubes, okay? And we'll call this one the larynx, the wind tube, the larynx right here, and this will be the esophagus, okay? So the esophagus sits immediately behind the larynx in your throat, okay? So larynx is here, esophagus is behind it. Behind it, okay? And when you're just hanging out and talking and breathing, your esophagus is closed. The opening to it is closed. When you swallow, it's tonically closed, meaning like the muscle that closes it is just always closed, the constrictor muscle that closes that esophagus behind there. So what happens when you swallow is your larynx, the non-ringed hand is the larynx, I guess. I don't know if I got that reversed, but anyway. So what happens is the larynx is going to move up and out, so it moves up and toward the chin, essentially, and that opens up the esophagus, that constrictor muscle releases a bit, it gets tugged on, opens it up, and then food is directed into the esophagus, thanks to actually my swallow instructor, Julie Barkmeyer-Kramer, would be very happy to know that I remember her clearly saying the epiglottis does not protect the airway during a swallow, which is what everybody says it does. It flaps down and protects the airway. It doesn't! Epiglottis doesn't do that. What the epiglottis does, because it doesn't create much of a seal, so it's not much of a protector if it is, but what it does is when the epiglottis flops down, it creates kind of a pathway such that the food and water moves around the larynx. So it kind of goes to the side and into the esophagus, okay? So I don't know. I kind of think of it as like this might be the most crazy analogy yet, but water park slides, right? Like you have, it all starts from one place and then you could have these branches of a water slide, like shoo! But you have that esophagus there, or the epiglottis, sorry, plop down there so that instead of you going down the middle slide, it's actually going down the side slides, which is an extra level of protection, kind of keeps things from going in. But your vocal folds adduct very tightly during a swallow. They are like the primary protector of your airway. And the vocal folds, when you cough, those are the things that are doing the air, but also the folds bang in and like really, that builds up enough air pressure that you can blow stuff out of your airway, which is the whole reason you cough a ton when something goes down the wrong tube. So when you have these physiological responses as a singer, of course you don't want that like right before you're about to go sing, but I want singers to have peace of mind that your body has physiologically been made this way, so your vocal folds have healing molecules, there's healing factors that will be released. They're released when you vibrate your vocal folds together, and especially when you cough. So after about 5 minutes or so, maybe 10 minutes, who knows how long it'll take, but after a little bit, your vocal folds are going to feel just fine. They're going to be fine again, essentially, okay? Your tissue will regenerate. It will heal itself from any sort of trauma that happens if you cough a ton because something went down the wrong tube. And I know that there are singers out there who worry about that a lot. If you find yourself coughing a lot, like you can't control your coughing, your throat always feels tickly and irritated, and you're coughing constantly, you might want to go see a doctor about that. But if it's just like, something went down the wrong way, and you cough, that is a natural, healthy response to have. So don't fight it, because you don't want stuff in your lungs, okay? Not the best idea. If you're healthy and a little bit of liquid gets in your lungs, your body will probably handle it fine in terms of your immune system, and your lymph system will wash things away really well. But on the whole, you don't want a ton. You don't want a lot in there, and you definitely just don't want it in there in general. It's just good. Your body doesn't want it in there either. So, so that's one thing. And the external laryngeal muscles, I didn't really mention those very much last time, but you have laryngeal elevators, obviously, because you swallow. Whoop, it moves up and out. And that's what the laryngeal elevators do. If you put your fingers here and you swallow, you feel where your little bump is there, your Adam's apple, or if you're a woman, it tends to be your cricoid cartilage instead of thyroid. But if you swallow while your fingers are there, you'll feel it go up and kind of disappear a little bit. Kind of goes up and kind of almost tucks under the tongue, essentially, way under here. And that's what a good healthy swallow should be. We call that hyolaryngeal excursion. Hyo, yeah, hyoid bone, hyolaryngeal excursion. It moves up and out. And that's what the laryngeal elevators do. And so those elevators, if you feel like you're singing something and you feel like your voice gets stuck up here, like your larynx is stuck really high and it feels kind of tight, you might have some activation of laryngeal elevators, which are not the most useful muscles to activate if you just want nice, easy phonation, right? They're much better, they're fine during a swallow, not so great during phonation to have. And then you do have laryngeal depressors. You only have a couple of them, muscles that lower the larynx. They tend to attach down here around the collarbone area and go up to the larynx there. And these depressors, I think, is where a lot of people get this funny idea that the lowered larynx position that classical singers are going for needs to occur from depressing the larynx with those depressors. actually physically moving it down. Now, you could do that. It's not like you couldn't do that strategy, and there are singers out there who do that strategy. But for me personally, if I think of consciously lowering my larynx, I get really tight. It seems to hinder good like healthy, easy phonation. It also seems to hinder my resonance a bit. It tends to make it kind of dark and covered, like I'm singing through like a cotton ball. Oh, like it's kind of woofy, that woofy sound. Not good. It would never carry over an orchestra. I can't do that woofy sound professionally. There's no way. One thing I want to mention is I do know, like, there's that whole breathing way into your pelvis thing, and I use it. I love that. Breathing way down low. When you take a big breath, you let the ribcage expand, but you also think of, like, releasing your pelvic floor and all that stuff, right? And I don't know exactly why that works the way it does, honestly. It works really well. I feel, for me, like I find that lowered laryngeal position like that, I get that oscuro, part of the chiaro oscuro, the dark sound, just happens without me trying for it. But I do think, I have a strong suspicion where this comes from. And I learned it in the preclinical class that I took with Jenny Hoyt, and she mentioned a study that I believe she did. She either did it or Hickson did, but it was back a little bit ago. But there are some passive connections, so passive being like not muscle tissue, like tendons and such, that will attach from the larynx into, like, say, the collarbone, the sternum, the chest area, right? Now, you don't want to breathe high, of course. You don't want to do that as a singer by any means. But if you expand really low, the collarbone also is going to expand out a bit. It's not going to raise. It's going to have a slight, maybe even like on the millimeter scale movement, right? Because of all the passive connections. Everything's all interconnected here, right? So I think the lowered pelvic stuff helps you to find the lowered laryngeal position through these passive connections. Because typically, in everyday life, we don't take giant breaths. Typically, the lower lobes of our lungs, right, they don't really get a ton of air into them unless you're working out or something and you're really, really ventilating. But we don't tend to take giant breaths. And I'm trying to find a picture of lungs, because I know there's a picture of lungs in here. Here we go. My textbook again. What? Okay. So there's a lung, right? Or two lungs, both lungs. Your trachea, the bronchial tubes there, and you get into, see the lobes, right? The upper, the middle, and the lower lobe on that side. So that's a 3-lobed lung. Your other lung only has 2 lobes because your heart is there, so it's a little smaller on the left side of your body. But when you look at how things branch into the lungs, I mean, if your body needs ventilation, if it needs oxygen, carbon dioxide, gas exchange, and you're just hanging out watching a TV, do you need to breathe really deeply? Probably not, right? Most of the time, no. But when you're singing, for a lot of singers, especially for sustaining really long phrases and all this stuff, taking deep breaths is very useful. We like it. We like that higher air pressure in our lungs to start from that point, at least, while we go through a long phrase, especially for singing Mozart. Good Lord. Right? So I think that what that lowered pelvic thing does, at least for me, having the sensation of a really low deep breath where the lower ribs are I really feel like my perception is really honed by, okay, my pelvis is releasing, my abdominal wall is releasing, my lower rib cage is really working, it's really expanding and stretching, and those muscles of the inhalation are really working for me. Then I feel like my larynx actually gets a little lower. So I think that is a way for my body anyway to take the deepest breath it possibly can, a much deeper breath than I normally take just in general. And that allows the collarbone to expand a little along with the rib cage, and then those passive connections just move the larynx down passively, no contractions, just relaxes it a little bit, essentially downward. And even just the slightest movement downward is going to make a huge shift in the acoustics because it makes my vocal tract a little bit longer. and things that are a little larger are going to resonate at lower frequencies, and so the lower harmonics in my voice will become a little more highlighted. I get the oscuro, the dark sound. Lower pitches tend to sound kind of dark to us. So that's, I think, where that comes from. The pelvic floor breath is really useful for getting a really full breath, getting the lower lobe, the lowest lobes in the lungs filled up. And when you get that really deep breath where the whole lung has expanded, the rib cage has expanded a great deal, and those passive connections from the larynx into the rib cage area, into the clavicle and the rib cage, they lower the larynx a little for you. And the reason, like when I'm just hanging out and sitting here and I just want a belt, yeah, the reason I feel like I can just go into a belt is because I don't need that. I don't need that lower connection when I'm just hanging out and sitting to belt, because it's not necessarily a part of the belt sound. I do need a certain amount of release, but I don't need that much, you know what I mean? I don't need that sort of oddly lowered laryngeal position. So, oddly being not my default, my neutral position. But if I need to sing classically, I want to start there, right? I want to start with that. Ooh. Lower position for a more dark sound. Hopefully, I'm really out of shape on that, but I should probably really practice my classical singing. But belt is easier because I don't have to worry about that. So anyway, that's a little bit of hopefully to help out with the what the heck is this lower laryngeal position. It's possible to attain it passively through passive connections, not contracting the depressors. Most of what the depressors are there for are just to help your larynx go down, physiologically speaking anyway. They just help to counteract, like when the laryngeal elevators release, if the depressors activate, your larynx goes back to its neutral position really fast after a swallow, which is really useful if you want to do like multiple swallows in a row. Like if you're chugging, you know, and you do gulp, 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 your larynx needs to move up and down pretty quickly. So a little extra active force on the release. They don't need to be super strong, because as long as you're sitting upright, gravity is going to handle most of it for you. But a little extra pull is going to make it really fast. I believe. I think I learned that in a class. I might have gotten that a little wrong, and my apologies to JBK if I did. Julie Bark-Mary Kramer, we call her JBK. If I did get that wrong, I'm sorry. I should have reviewed before I just spouted it online. But anyway, so don't think of the laryngeal depressors as being an active part of your singing. If you feel like thinking that way really messes you up. If you think that way and it seems to work for you, then okay, great. Let it keep on working for you. But if you're like me and you think of lowering your larynx, like actively lowering it, and it makes you sing with that woofy, overly dark sound, then maybe go back to the drawing board, and instead of thinking lower larynx, think, okay, I need the deepest breath possible. I need to release everything into the pelvic floor so that the diaphragm can contract on the inhale really low, and my rib cage can really expand, and I can get that nice passive connection in the throat, which is, coincidentally, when you take a yawn, that beginning of a yawn or the top of a yawn, you're kind of taking the deepest breath possible on a yawn, right? So if I can kind of force myself into a yawn, I got to think about yawning, and then, oh, when you take a really deep yawn, you might feel that actually lower a little bit. You might feel that this expands a little, and some of these muscles get kind of stretched out, and this actually does, the bump actually does lower a little, just like when you feel it on a swallow, it goes up. I can forcibly lower it like that, and then I sound really weird, and it's really hard, and I feel strained. Or I can yawn it. Oh yeah, there it goes. Oh, it's this nice, easy, lowered space, which I could talk through, I could sing through. I keep having to remind myself to yawn to keep it up there, but to keep my breath up there. But yeah, so that's, I think, what that is for. So myth of if you cough a ton because something went down your throat, that might cause like nodules or something. Likely it won't. Pretty sure, you know, the chance of that, I'm not saying there's a non-zero chance, I'm just saying it's really unlikely, okay? But your body heals, your vocal folds heal from that kind of stuff. It's good. You want to protect your airway. That's what the larynx does. And that is why if you have a family member who has any sort of neurological damage, if they're post-stroke, if they're post-radiation treatment, chemotherapy, those kind of things can have effects on the nervous system that can make swallowing difficult. And if you have a family member who's in that kind of condition as a singer, best to listen to the medical team that's trying to look out for their voice and trying to get good laryngeal closure, because it's not just about the voice at that point. It's also about keeping their airway safe for eating and swallowing, keeping their lungs clean of any liquid that might leak into them, and keeping them healthy, essentially, as much as possible. And nobody likes it when you take them off of real food. That's not, like, nobody wants to be not eating real food because they can't swallow. So, you know, that's one of the things that on the medical side we take into consideration, and we take very seriously, that voice teachers and singers, you don't need to worry about it, really, unless you become a patient that does have to worry about it. And then that's a medical issue, not a singing issue. Does that make sense? I hope. All right. So that's a little extra, like, bonus laryngeal physiology. What? No way. And there's that passive connection that helps you lower your larynx if you take a ginormous breath, essentially. A really low, like, it's the relaxed breath that allows your lungs to really fill up, not the, like, not like a gaspy, because you don't actually fill up as much with the gaspy as you do with, like, yeah, that diaphragm is really able to contract very low because the abdominal viscera got really out of the way because you really released your abdominal wall. Your pelvic floor dropped even to the point, like, your lower abdominals were dropping and releasing and relaxing, and got the lung bases, the base of your lungs got really full of air. It's not very often. A lot of people don't even get that deep of a breath in, just in general. Most people, like, you know, just default setting, you don't tend to, even in exercise, you might not even get that deep of a breath. But, like, yogis do, and classical singers do. So there you go. So if you hear about that, you can work with it, you can play around with it. Helps you get that lowered larynx for your classical singing without it being an active contraction you're actively trying to lower. There you go. All right, hopefully that's helpful while you're playing around with stuff. I'll see you guys next time with the filter, the vocal track, woo, acoustics. I love acoustics, but I'll try to make it easy for you. Try to make it a little more distilled. All right, see you guys next time. Bye.